They didn't know who he was. Not the blonde flight attendant with the bright smile and sharper tongue. Not the businessmen in tailored suits, sipping champagne in first class. Not even the passengers silently watching from their screens, ready to capture a spectacle, but never the dignity of a man. But by the time the wheels of that plane touched down in West Africa, everyone on board would be forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Real power doesn't need a title to be respected. It just needs the strength to stay silent when the world expects you to roar. It began quietly, as these stories often do, on a sun-soaked afternoon at the airport. Families hugged and hurried. Tourists bickered over baggage. Flight 227 bound for West Africa was boarding. Among the crowd was a man dressed in a simple black tunic. No jewelry, no suitcase full of gadgets, just calm eyes and a ticket to seat 2A. He didn't fit the picture many held in their minds of a first-class passenger. No laptop, no expensive watch, no designer shoes, just quiet confidence and presence. Inside the lounge, he sat without fuss. While others scrolled and bragged about business deals, he sat still, observing. When the call came for first-class passengers to board, he stood, ticket in hand, and walked to the gate. The flight attendant at the gate, all red lips and judgmental glances, welcomed the sharply dressed white businessman ahead of him with an artificial charm polished by years of routine. But when her eyes met the quiet man, something shifted. Her smile faltered. She looked him up and down, lips pursed. "You must be lost," she said, half laughing. "This lane's for first class." He handed her the ticket. Seat 2A, first class. Her voice lowered, laced with disbelief. "You can't sit here," she said. "This flight, it's not for someone like you." Heads turned. A few gasps slipped through the line. Someone began recording, but the man didn't raise his voice. He simply repeated, "That's my seat." Clara, her name glinting on the gold badge pinned to her uniform, wasn't finished. "Let's not make a scene," she said loudly. "You'll be refunded. Just step aside." But he wouldn't move. Not out of defiance, but because dignity doesn't step aside. A younger flight attendant, barely out of training, scanned the ticket. The beep confirmed what the man had calmly known all along. It was valid. Still, Clara didn't yield. "Look at him," she hissed. "Does that look like someone who belongs in 2A?" The quiet man said nothing. He waited patiently, giving way to a mother with a baby. Clara's eyes narrowed. "You won't last long in that seat," she muttered, finally stepping aside. He boarded in silence, slipping into seat 2A without fanfare. First class was cool and quiet. Leather seats, soft lighting, the faint scent of luxury in the air. He placed his bag above, sat down, and pulled out a notebook. While others stretched, drank, and bragged about deals made and money spent, he wrote. And from 3 rows away, a French executive named Francois took notice. Clara entered the cabin soon after, her fake smile intact, for everyone but him. As she passed his seat, she skipped the usual greetings. No hot towel, no polite offer of champagne. When he asked for water, she didn't ask if he preferred sparkling or still. She dropped a bottle in front of him like it didn't belong there. It nearly tipped over. He caught it, nodded gently, and took a sip. Her message was clear. His response was quieter, but far more powerful. Francois watched this unfold with growing discomfort. The man in 2A hadn't said 10 words since boarding, but carried himself like someone who had walked through fire and come out whole. There was no arrogance, just presence. As lunch was served, Clara placed trays with precision in front of each guest. Cloth napkins folded, plates balanced. Except for one. She dropped the man's tray with a careless clatter and sneered, "Hope this is good enough for you." That was enough for Francois. He turned to her, calm but firm. "Why are you treating him this way?" Clara, caught off guard, went to mount him off. "Mind your business." But Francois didn't. "This is my business," he said. "I paid for peace, not to witness cruelty." A slow murmur moved through the cabin. A woman whispered to her husband. Someone clapped once. Clara turned and marched to the galley. Inside, she paced, her pride bruised. "Who does he think he is?" she muttered. Back in 2A, the man closed his eyes. The cabin shook gently with turbulence. "Fasten your seatbelts," the captain announced. Clara returned. She leaned over. "You better buckle up tight," she said, almost smiling. He looked at her calmly. "Thank you for the reminder." She hadn't expected that. Her expression cracked. He was used to storms, in the sky and on the ground, but this one felt different. Not because of the hostility, but because of the watching eyes, the silent passengers who said nothing as dignity was dragged through a first-class aisle. And he said nothing. He just sat, as if he knew that silence, when held with grace, can cut deeper than shouting ever could. As the cabin lights dimmed and the plane steadied above the clouds, something heavier than air hung in first class. It wasn't just turbulence, it was tension. The kind that seeps into the corners of a room when one person's silence says more than everyone else's noise. The man in seat 2A hadn't moved much since takeoff. He hadn't stretched like the others, hadn't ordered wine. He simply stared out the window, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the clouds. The flight attendant, Clara, moved through the cabin with tight lips and heavy footsteps. She served others with performative politeness, napkins perfectly placed, drinks with lemon slices balanced delicately. But when it came to 2A, her grace disappeared. She skipped his hot towel. She passed his seat like it wasn't there. She pretended not to hear him when he asked for assistance, but passengers were noticing. Beside him, an older French woman in seat 2B leaned over and whispered, "Why does she keep ignoring you?" Her voice was soft but concerned. He only smiled gently. Across the aisle, a couple exchanged glances. A man murmured, "I don't think she believes he belongs here." Phones were already recording earlier. Now people were paying attention with their eyes too. The junior flight attendant, the same one who had scanned the ticket, approached Clara again. His voice lowered with urgency. "You need to stop. People are noticing. They're filming. This isn't just rude, it's wrong." Clara didn't blink. "Let them film," she snapped. "He bought the seat? Fine, but that doesn't mean he belongs here." Her words hung in the air like smoke, bitter, clinging. The plane rocked slightly again. Over the intercom, the pilot's voice crackled. "We're passing through a brief weather disturbance. Please remain seated." Clara moved back through first class, checking belts with unnecessary harshness. When she reached 2A, she stopped, stared, and smirked. "Wouldn't want you flying out of your seat," she said. The man looked at her, calm and steady. "Thank you for the reminder." There was no sarcasm in his voice, no spite, just a calm so unshakable it was almost unnerving. Clara moved on, rattled but unwilling to show it. Lunch arrived shortly after. A tray was placed before the man again, this time with even less ceremony. No words, no napkin, just a thud on the tray table. Still he nodded, "Thank you." Across the aisle, Francois Delacour set down his drink and turned toward Clara as she passed. "Why are you doing this?" he asked firmly. Clara stopped, her face tightening. "Doing what?" "Treating him like he doesn't matter." She looked around, then hissed, "He's not supposed to be here. Look at him." Francois's voice remained even, but his words cut clean. "You have embarrassed this airline. You have embarrassed yourself. That man has shown more dignity and silence than I've seen in years of business." Others nodded quietly. One woman clapped again, this time louder. Clara turned on her heel and disappeared into the galley. There, surrounded by coffee pots and clattering trays, she muttered to herself, "Who does he think he is? Why is everyone defending him?" But no answer came, just the low hum of a jet engine and the distant memory of power slipping from her hands. Back in his seat, the man folded away his tray. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and touched a soft, worn piece of cloth, a national emblem folded carefully. He hadn't worn it today, didn't need to. It was in his heart, stitched into every breath he took. Soon, the pilot's voice echoed again. "Cabin crew, prepare for arrival. We'll be landing shortly." The quiet rustle of seatbelts, the clink of glasses being cleared, the nervous shuffle of passengers preparing to land. It all filled the cabin. But in seat 2A, there was stillness, focus, presence while Clara returned one last time before descent. She stopped beside his seat, arms crossed. "I hope next time you choose the right cabin," she said coldly. "You're lucky we didn't throw you off this plane." The man turned his head, slowly, eyes calm, voice measured. "Sometimes the seat we choose says less about comfort and more about what we stand for. I will continue to sit here, not because I need to, but because something needs to change." She blinked. The words confused her, like a mirror she didn't want to look into. As the clouds gave way to the lights of Ouagadougou below, the quiet man tightened his belt and looked straight ahead. Around him, passengers packed up. Some stared, others bowed their heads, but all of them, including Clara, were about to learn who he truly was. The landing was smooth, the wheels kissed the tarmac gently. A soft voice over the speakers welcomed them to Burkina Faso. Polite applause rose and fell. People stood, stretched, and reached for bags. But the eyes in first class weren't on the overhead bins. They were on him. Seat 2A. He hadn't flinched, not at the insults, not at the cold shoulder, not at the weight of suspicion cast on him again and again. He had sat through it all like a mountain unmoved by weather. Clara, not finished yet, approached him as passengers began to file out. Her voice lowered again, like a blade drawn in shadow. "I wish you never boarded this plane," she whispered. "You smell like someone who hasn't bathed in a month. Sitting in first class doesn't make you clean. It just makes the cabin stink." Her words landed like stones. Still he said nothing, but his eyes met hers with the same stillness. Not cold, not angry, just honest. And then someone else had enough. The elderly woman in seat 2B, watching silently all this time, leaned forward. Her voice was crisp. "That's enough." Clara turned. "Stay out of this," she barked. "No," the woman replied. "I will not. You've gone too far." From across the aisle, Francois stood up. "Clara," he said, his voice commanding, "you have disgraced this airline. That man," he pointed gently, "has more dignity in his silence than you have shown in all your words. He is not just someone who belongs here. He is someone we should learn from." Silence swept through the cabin like a sudden wind. Clara's face flushed red. Her hands trembled. But it was too late. Outside, the steps had been lowered. But this was no ordinary landing. A black car idled on the tarmac. Soldiers stood at attention. A red carpet stretched across the concrete. People pressed to the windows. Someone whispered, "Who's the VIP?" Another murmured, "Royalty?" Then the younger flight attendant stepped up to Clara, his phone in hand. "You need to see this." On the screen, a photo of the man in 2A. In military dress, flags behind him, salutes from rows of soldiers. The title, President Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso. Clara's face went pale. Her hand holding the phone trembled. She blinked, hoping the image would vanish or change into something easier to believe. But it didn't. There he was, President Ibrahim Traoré, standing in full military uniform, his face solemn, his hand raised in a salute, the same calm expression he had worn the entire flight. Not a rich tourist, not a man who accidentally found himself in the wrong cabin. The leader of a nation. She turned her head toward him. He was standing now, reaching up to retrieve his modest bag from the overhead compartment. There was no announcement, no grand gesture. He moved the same way he'd boarded, quietly, purposefully. No, this can't be," Clara muttered, her voice dry and breaking. She stepped toward him. "Sir," she called out softly now, almost pleading. He stopped and turned. I didn't know," she stammered. "I didn't mean to." Her words failed. She looked into his eyes, expecting anger, maybe fury. But there was none, only steady calm. The same calm she had mistaken for weakness. He looked at her gently and said, "Would it have made a difference if you had known?" That question, so simple yet so damning, struck her harder than any reprimand could. She opened her mouth, but no answer came. He didn't wait. "Respect," he said, "is not a gift we give to the powerful. It is a duty we owe every human being." Then he turned and stepped off the plane. The sun outside was bright. The soldiers saluted sharply. One opened the door of the waiting car, but President Traoré paused. He turned back to face the aircraft. his eyes scanning the windows. Inside, many passengers had risen from their seats. Some wiped away tears, others simply looked down in shame. Francois, the French businessman, stepped onto the tarmac and caught up with him. "Mr. President," he said, voice low, humble, "please accept my deepest apology. I had no idea who you were. But your humility, it's something I will never forget." President Traoré smiled softly. "Sometimes, to see what's in a man's heart, we must walk beneath his expectations," he said. They shook hands like equals, though one carried a title and the other a lesson. Inside the plane, Clara had collapsed into an empty seat. Her hands covered her face. The junior attendant stood next to her, silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You didn't just insult a president. You insulted everyone who's ever been made to feel small for how they look." The captain, now standing at the front of the cabin, addressed her with quiet authority. "Prepare a report. You will be questioned." Meanwhile, news was already spreading. Even before the last bags had been unloaded, social media had erupted. Videos from the plane, Clara's raised voice, the quiet man sitting still, Francois defending him. All of it was circulating across every platform. People were outraged, others were inspired. Many were just deeply ashamed. In the airport, whispers filled the air. "He was on that flight," someone said. "President Traoré." And Clara, "She said those things to him?" Security personnel straightened their backs. Airline staff fumbled nervously. In a small office just past the jet bridge, Clara sat in front of the airline manager. He paced in front of her, a folder clutched in his hands. "Do you understand what you've done?" he said sharply. "I didn't know," she started, voice cracking. "That's not the issue," he interrupted. "It's not about who he is. It's about what you said. This flight is not for someone of your color? That's what you told him? That he smelled? That he wasn't clean enough for first class?" Tears streamed down Clara's cheeks. "I was doing my job," she whispered. "No, you were abusing your position," he said. "And it's not the first time." She looked up in shock. "What? You think we haven't gotten complaints? You think this behavior was invisible before today?" Outside, President Traoré sat in his car. The airport director stood at the window, sweating under the sun, struggling to speak. "Mr. President, we are so sorry. If we had known..." President Traoré raised his hand. "That is the problem," he said. "You only care when you know." The words landed like stone. The director fell silent. "I flew today not to be tested, but to experience what others do. And now I know." He turned his gaze back to the building. "That woman did not insult me alone," he continued. "She insulted millions of Africans, rich or poor, young or old. That level of prejudice lives in too many hearts." "She's been suspended immediately," the director said quickly. "She won't be flying again." Traoré didn't respond. His silence carried more weight than any punishment. Suddenly, a reporter's voice rang out from nearby. "Mr. President, will you press charges?" He turned to her calmly. "No," he said. "I don't need to jail anyone to make a point. The world saw. That's enough." Back inside, Clara sat alone in a silent room. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Messages rolled in, wave after wave. Strangers, former friends, coworkers. "You're trending for the wrong reason." "How could you say that? Shame on you." But the one message that hit hardest wasn't from the public. It was from her mother. "I raised you better than this. I am disappointed." Clara dropped the phone and buried her face in her hands. That night, under the warm lights of Ouagadougou, a quiet crowd gathered outside the presidential palace. Reporters lined up their cameras. Microphones were tested. Security stood watchful but relaxed. They weren't waiting for a political briefing or military update. They were waiting for something deeper, something human. When President Ibrahim Traoré finally stepped onto the stage, he wore no parade uniform, no golden sash, just his usual military jacket and the small flag of his nation pinned proudly near his heart. He looked out across the crowd, journalists, citizens, children perched on shoulders, elders wrapped in traditional shawls. He cleared his throat. Silence followed. "This morning," he began, "I boarded a plane not as a president, but as a passenger." He paused. The words hung in the air. "I carried no title. I brought no staff. I had no need for people to know my name." The crowd listened closely. But what I received on that flight, he continued, was more than poor service. It was hate, disrespect, shame, not for me as a person, but for what I represent in the eyes of those who refuse to see dignity beyond color. He looked directly into the cameras, as if speaking to every living room, office, and classroom tuned in. Some people believe power only wears a suit and tie, that it comes with accents and European names, that skin like mine must earn its right to sit at the front of a plane. He paused again. Some in the crowd lowered their heads. I want the world to understand something, he said firmly. You don't need to be a president to be treated with respect. You only need to be a person. Applause broke out. Some clapped slowly, others shouted from the back. A few quietly wiped their eyes. Then, with the same calm that stunned a cabin full of strangers, he raised his hand. The crowd quieted again. I forgive her, he said. Gasps echoed. Yes, I forgive her, he repeated. Not because I am weak, but because the lesson has already been taught. She now faces a mirror she cannot ignore. Whether she chooses to grow is now her choice. He ended the speech with a sentence that would be quoted across the continent. True power, he said, is not in the title you wear, but in the way you treat the one sitting beside you. The applause rose like a wave. Flashbulbs exploded, but President Traoré simply stepped back, nodded once, and disappeared behind the curtain. That night, television anchors across Africa and Europe replayed the video of the speech again and again. Teachers discussed it in classrooms. Community leaders quoted it in church halls and town centers. Ordinary people sat with their families, watching in silence. Even Clara. Still suspended, she sat alone in a small apartment, her phone turned off, her uniform folded in a bag near the door, her eyes red, her heart heavier than it had ever been. The forgiveness hit her like a storm she hadn't prepared for. She had expected shame, maybe public rebuke, but not that. Not grace. She picked up a pen, not her phone, not a screen, a real pen. On plain paper, she began to write. There was no PR agent coaching her, no camera waiting for content, just a woman trying to confront herself honestly for the first time in years. Dear President Ibrahim Traoré, she wrote, I am sorry, not because you are a president, but because you are a human being, and I failed to treat you as one. I was blind with pride, poisoned by ignorance. I saw your silence as weakness, your peace as submission, but I was wrong. You showed me strength I've never known. You had every right to humiliate me, yet you forgave me. I will never forget that moment, and I pray one day I can prove I've changed. She signed it simply, Clara. She didn't know if he would ever read it, but she needed to send it. At the presidential palace days later, the letter sat quietly on a polished desk. Traoré opened it with calm hands. He read every word, slowly, twice. Then he folded it gently and placed it inside a drawer. A knock came at the door. Come in, he said. His assistant entered, holding a thick folder. Mr. President, she said, we've received hundreds of letters from citizens, airport staff, school children, even apology messages from other airlines. People are deeply moved. He nodded, listening quietly. I didn't plan for any of this, he said. That day, I just wanted peace. I didn't want to teach a lesson. His assistant smiled gently. But your silence taught more than a speech ever could. He stood and walked toward the window. Sunlight poured across the polished floor. I've been thinking, he said, forgiveness is important, but it's not enough. We must educate. He turned back, his voice firmer now. What happened that day wasn't just a mistake. It was a mirror reflecting what still lives inside many hearts. His assistant waited. Prepare a national campaign, he said. Let's call it the Dignity Project. Train customer service teams. Teach kindness in schools. Remind people that status doesn't define humanity. He paused. Let this story be more than news. Let it be change. She nodded. Yes, Mr. President. While change began unfolding in Burkina Faso, Clara had not returned to work. Her suspension was indefinite. The airline had launched an internal review, and the backlash from the public was far from quiet. But instead of hiding, she began to show up. Not where cameras waited, but where people were forgotten. Each morning, Clara reported to a local shelter that served immigrants and refugees. She didn't wear a name badge or makeup. She didn't check her phone every 10 minutes. She wore simple clothes and asked simple questions. Can I help? What do you need? She served meals. She mopped floors. She cleaned toilets. No one knew who she had been, and for once, she was glad. She began to see the stories, in the eyes of a man waiting in line for food, in the voice of a young mother searching for housing, and in the silence of a little girl named Aminata who sat in the corner clutching a worn teddy bear. Clara sat down beside her gently. "What's your name?" she asked. The girl looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Aminata." Clara smiled. "That's a beautiful name." The girl hesitated, then said, "At school, they call me Dirty." The words hit Clara like cold water. She swallowed hard and reached out. "They're wrong," she said quietly. "You are not dirty. You are beautiful, just like your name." That night, Clara wept, not from shame, from clarity, because finally she was seeing what she had once refused to see, the weight of words, the way prejudice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in hallways and hides behind uniforms, and sometimes it lives in silence. She wrote again, "Dear Mr. President, I don't expect a reply. I just want you to know I am changing, not because I got caught, but because I was wrong. Every day I meet people who remind me of you, quiet, gentle, full of dignity. I see them now. I really see them. Thank you for not yelling. Your silence was loud enough to wake me up." Clara back in Burkina Faso months later, President Traoré was invited to speak at a university in Ghana. The topic, leadership and character. The auditorium filled early. Students packed the aisles, professors leaned forward, pens in hand. Cameras rolled quietly. When he stepped onto the stage, there was no music, no applause, just silence and anticipation. "My story is not special," he began. "Millions of people are disrespected every day, simply because of how they look. Not because of anything they've done, but because someone else decided they weren't enough." He scanned the crowd, young faces, open minds. "I was called dirty. I was told I didn't belong. I was laughed at, not as a president, but as a man with dark skin. I stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I wanted to listen." The audience leaned in. "Listen," he said firmly, "to the pain of others, to the voice in your heart, to the moments when you can choose dignity over dominance." He turned and pointed to the screen behind him. On it was a single sentence. "If your power makes others feel small, it is not power. It is weakness." There was silence. Then the applause came, slow at first, then rising into thunder. Students stood, professors wiped their eyes. That quote would later be painted across campus walls, printed on t-shirts, even displayed in airports around the continent. Not as a slogan, as a reminder. In the months that followed, Clara continued her work at the shelter. No one asked her for autographs, no one took selfies, but every time she helped someone without being asked, she felt a little more human. And when she saw someone ignored because of how they looked, she didn't look away. She stood up, not to prove a point, but because it was the right thing to do. In a quiet corner of her apartment, she had hung a printed copy of the president's quote. "If your power makes others feel small, it is not power, it is weakness." She read it each morning and each night before bed. And in Burkina Faso, the Dignity Project began to bloom. Schools added it to their curriculum. Customer service teams were trained not just in procedure, but in presence. Government offices held monthly reflection meetings where stories were shared and voices long silenced were finally heard. It wasn't a perfect change, but it was real. The quiet man in seat 2A had stepped onto a plane to fly home, but he had landed as a symbol, not because he wanted to be, but because the world needed one. Months passed, then a year. The world moved on, as it always does, but some stories don't fade. They grow quietly, steadily, like roots spreading underground until one day they bloom again, where least expected. In a remote village in southern Mali, a teacher stood before her students holding a worn copy of a printed speech. She had underlined a sentence with red ink and written it on the blackboard for her class to copy. Respect is not a gift for the powerful. It is a duty to every human being. Her students, no older than 12, wrote carefully. Some had never been on a plane. Some had never seen a president in person. But they knew the story of the quiet man in seat 2A. Their teacher had made sure of it. Across the ocean, in a small town in Alabama, a retired pastor watched the same story play out on a documentary channel. He sat with his grandchildren, eyes fixed on the television, as President Traoré's words echoed through the room. When the program ended, he turned to the children and said, "That is what grace looks like." And in France, Clara continued her life far from the cameras. The airline had let her go permanently, but she never tried to hide from what she had done. Instead, she let it change her. She found work at a nonprofit that provided housing and aid for displaced families. She taught others how to serve with humility, how to speak carefully, how to see before judging. One afternoon, she received an envelope, no return address. Inside was a photo, a little girl, Aminata, smiling, holding her teddy bear, now sewn and mended. On the back were 5 words written in a child's handwriting: "I know I am clean." Clara placed the photo on her wall, and she cried again. Meanwhile, President Traoré rarely spoke of the incident, not because he forgot, but because he had already spoken enough. His campaign, the Dignity Project, had become more than a slogan. It had become a movement, one based not on punishment, but on possibility, a chance for people to do better. In the Capitol, murals were painted. One showed a plane in the clouds, a single seat marked in gold, 2A. Another displayed his quote in bold letters across the side of a government building. Visitors from other countries stopped to take photos. Some asked about the story, others already knew. At international conferences, when President Traoré walked into a room, other leaders now rose, not because of rank, but because of respect earned not through speeches or power plays, but through patience and principle. And still through it all, he remained the same, quiet, composed, focused not on image, but impact. One evening, during a private dinner with educators and youth organizers, a young woman stood up and asked, "Mr. President, why didn't you say who you were on that plane? Why not reveal your identity and stop her before it went so far?" He smiled softly. "Because if I had told her who I was, she would have treated me differently, and I would have learned nothing." The room fell silent. "It wasn't about me," he continued. "It was about what lives in the hearts of those who believe respect must be earned through titles. I needed to see the truth, not just about her, but about the world we've built." He looked around the room. "You can't fix what you refuse to see." Later that night, he wrote in his journal a single sentence: "We must never let silence become approval, but sometimes silence is the strongest mirror we can offer." That mirror had been held up, and thousands had looked into it. In classrooms, in churches, in courtrooms, in homes. And in 1,000 quiet places, ordinary people made small as hitting decisions: to hold the door for someone, to listen longer, to wait before judging, to smile first. There was no award ceremony for what he had done, no statue built in his honor, but he didn't need that. What he had planted was larger than a moment. It was a new way of looking, a shift in the wind, a quiet revolution. Years passed, but the memory of that flight never left the minds of those who were on it. Not because it was dramatic or loud, but because it revealed something many had long chosen not to face. It showed that prejudice often hides behind polite smiles and company uniforms. That dignity, even when ignored, never disappears. It waits quietly until it teaches. In a museum exhibit on modern African leadership, a glass case displayed an ordinary airline ticket. Next to it, a plain black tunic. A small card beneath read, "Seat 2A," where silence spoke louder than position. Visitors passed by, paused, took photos. Some cried, some smiled. In airports across Africa, a quiet transformation had taken root. New training programs taught staff about unconscious bias, about dignity, about the weight of every interaction. A poster campaign was launched, and in dozens of languages, the same phrase was printed near check-in counters and boarding gates. The person in front of you is a story you haven't read yet, Clara. Years removed from her uniform, visited one such airport while traveling to a conference on social healing. She paused when she saw the poster. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass. She stood there a long time. Then she walked forward. At the conference, she spoke publicly for the first time since the incident. She wasn't a headliner. She wasn't introduced with applause. She simply stepped up and spoke. I used to believe that doing your job meant following policy, keeping order, not asking questions. But I've learned, she said, voice steady but soft, that sometimes silence can harm more than shouting. That dismissing someone isn't about words. It's about what's missing in your heart. She looked out over the crowd. The man I mistreated was not just a president. He was a mirror. He showed me who I really was. And for that, I am thankful. The room was quiet. Then slowly people stood. They didn't cheer. They didn't clap wildly. They just stood. In respect. Back in Burkina Faso, President Traoré continued his work. He declined interviews about the flight, refused offers to turn the story into a movie. He didn't want fame, he wanted movement. And the Dignity Project had become just that. In schools, students recited the story not as history, but as principle. Customer service handbooks quoted his words. Governments in neighboring countries requested his team's help developing similar initiatives. And yet, he remained unchanged. One morning, as he walked through a crowded market, a small boy approached him. Dirty sandals, torn shirt, eyes full of curiosity. Are you really the man from the plane? He asked. President Traoré knelt to meet him eye to eye. Yes, he said with a smile. Did it make you sad? He paused. It made me aware, and sometimes awareness is the first step toward making the world better. The boy nodded, then reached into his pocket and handed the president a folded piece of paper. It was a drawing, a stick-figure man sitting in a plain window seat, a red heart drawn above his head. I drew this for you, the boy said shyly. President Traoré accepted the drawing with care. Thank you, he replied, placing it in the same pocket where he once carried his national emblem, because both represented something worth protecting. That evening, as the sun set over the city, Traoré wrote in his notebook, "Power isn't proven by rising above others, but by staying among them, even when wronged." Elsewhere, a teacher told his story to adult learners. Many had lived through injustice, but this quiet story sparked something. I used to think nothing could change, one man said, but that man, he didn't yell or leave, and somehow that changed everything. Time passed. The story became a parable, told in classrooms, echoed in speeches. At a leadership seminar in Washington, a lawyer paused her talk and pointed to a photo of Traoré calmly exiting the plane. "This is how you redefine strength," she said. In Burkina Faso, Traoré refused interviews, not out of fear, but humility. "You can film the impact," he told a crew, "but not me." And so they filmed teachers, customer service trainers, and young men choosing empathy over silence. All ripples from a single act of stillness. And Clara? She now led training across Europe. Her workshops began not with pride, but truth. I was the woman who told a president he didn't belong, and I was wrong. She faced criticism, but kept going. One day she received a letter. "Growth is slow. Forgiveness doesn't erase truth. But I see your steps. Keep going." Ibrahim. She held it close, knowing she had changed. Traoré continued his humble service. Before each major meeting, he would glance at 3 keepsakes: Clara's letter, a child's photo, and a paper plane marked Seat 2A, symbols of regret, repair, and rebirth. Universities taught the story, business schools analyzed it, and in homes worldwide, parents told their children, "Once a man stayed in his seat and changed the world." An airline later created a scholarship in his name. Near boarding zones, quiet plaques read, "This seat belongs to whoever has the strength to occupy it with grace." Clara no longer drew people, only small moments. Kindness, empathy, quiet change. She was often recognized. "Aren't you the flight attendant?" "Yes," she'd say simply. One day she received a letter from a former passenger. "I said nothing that day, but your growth gave me courage. I now speak up. Thank you." And in a quiet West African airport, a fading plaque still reads, "True power isn't in your title, but in how you treat the person beside you." A child asked his mother what it meant. it means you treat people well, especially when they're different. The story of Seat 2A lives on, not because it was loud, but because it was true. Because sometimes the most powerful change comes from refusing to move from the seat you've earned.